fucking epic Hoovians. We're gonna post about Super Hulock. No. Hi everyone, it's DracCast for this week, which is the official podcast of Dracula Core and Eastback. And if you don't know what Eastback is, it's eek! Spiders in my pants! Ah! Crap. I'm your host, Dracman, and this week we're talking about a classic Doctor Who serial, which you may have been able to tell based on the intro I did, called State of Decay. State of Decay is a 4-part serial from the classic Doctor Who during the Tom Baker years, the 4th Doctor. And I guess I should just take this moment to mention that I was under the impression up until fairly recently that everyone was at least vaguely aware of what Doctor Who was. Like even if you didn't watch Doctor Who, I figured most people knew the basics of it. They knew like what the basic premise and concept and conceit was. I learned recently that that isn't the case. Even if you've heard of the show, there's a lot of people who don't know anything about it. So I guess I have to explain what Doctor Who is very briefly. Doctor Who is a show that has been on since the 60s, not consistently. There was a long period of time where it wasn't on, in a regular capacity at least. But it is a television series from the United Kingdom, and it is about a guy named the Doctor. And when I say a guy, I mean the Doctor has most recently been played by a woman, so not necessarily a guy, but pretty consistently up until then was always played by a male actor. That's not important. What is important is that Doctor Who is a show about a character whose name isn't Doctor Who. His name is the Doctor, and he is from an alien planet called Gallifrey, and he is a Time Lord. He's a Lord of Time and Space, and he travels around in his Turdis, which, despite sounding vaguely inappropriate, is actually just the name of his spaceship that is also a time machine, because you would need a time machine. There was also a space machine, as has been discussed countless times. He is a Lord of Time and Space, and he travels around just hanging out and meeting all kinds of crazy people along the way. You can tell in a lot of ways that Doctor Who was, and this is true, originally developed as a children's educational show because of that format. It basically has the same premise as the Magic School Bus. But pretty early on, it stopped being that, and it became a show that was still largely for children, but was much more like an action-adventure kind of thing. A little bit suspenseful. And even by this point, the show had sort of begun to stray more into just like general science, like all ages style science fiction. There's some stuff in this episode that I can imagine might scare some kids in like back in the day, but probably not now. Really quickly, I guess, another element of Doctor Who, like I mentioned, there's the 4th Doctor. The reason that the Doctor changes actors in the show, not in real life, the reason in real life is that William Hartnell didn't want to do it anymore, from what I understand. And so they needed to replace the Doctor with someone else, and they made up a reason in-universe. And the in-universe reason is that the Doctor's race, the Gallifreyans of Gallifrey, have a unique ability called regeneration, where when they die, they essentially, instead of dying, regenerate into a completely different body. The bodies are the same people, they have the same memories, but they are kind of different. They generally have slightly different personalities. This is, I don't know if there's an in-universe explanation for that. I think there is. I've always just interpreted it as like different elements of the same sort of personality coming out, because there's a lot of consistent elements of the Doctor, across all of these incarnations. It's a little bit like James Bond if at the end of like one of the James Bond movies, he just turned into the next actor. Like if Pierce Brosnan just went and turned into Daniel Craig. That's basically what it is. Except that they have fun with the science fiction premise of like, what if when you died, you just turned into a different person? And so this is the fourth Doctor, who is the fourth of the four Doctors that had been out at this point, which is a very dumb thing of me to say, I realize, but it is a true thing. He was the fourth of the four Doctors who had been out at this point. And one thing about the fourth Doctor is I think he's probably up until like the modern era of the not modern, the contemporary era of the show, with like Christopher Eccleston and David Tennant onward, is that I think the fourth Doctor, played by Tom Baker, was the most iconic. He has the long scarf, the big curly hair, the hat. He's the iconic Doctor. He's the one that like your mom thinks of when she thinks of Doctor Who. At least my mom. Anyway, the reason I'm talking about this on the show is not just because I like Doctor Who. It's because this is, I haven't noted that, I don't think, until now. State of Decay is about vampires. This is the introduction of vampires into the Whoniverse, and is an episode that feels like it should have a lot of like lore repercussions in show. It doesn't. They basically, from what I understand, having not seen all of Classic Who, this is, from what I understand, basically never brought up again in the show to any significant degree. We'll talk about it. And I guess really quickly I should just give my backstory with Doctor Who, which is that I was a kid when the reboot came out. Neither of my parents liked Doctor Who at all, really. And so I never watched any of it when it first came out. But I had friends in middle school was actually when I started watching it. So middle school I had friends who really liked it. And so I started watching it. And that is the story. It's not that interesting. Because I had wanted to watch it since I was young. Because I even as a young kid, I knew people who liked it. And I thought it sounded cool. But the problem with it wasn't that my parents wouldn't let me watch it. It's that I didn't know how. I didn't know what channel it was on. This was pre-Netflix. So I didn't watch it. I didn't know how to pirate things because I was a child. So I just didn't watch it. But by the time I was pretty young when I actually did start watching it. And Doctor Who is also a thing that I've been in and out of interest in. I have not watched much of the 13th Doctor's run. I'll admit that what I've seen of it I didn't like. I know that there's some differing opinions on the 13th Doctor, and more specifically not of her, because I think most people like her well enough, of like the writing and the production of that era of this show. And yeah, everything I didn't like about it was not that actress's fault, or even really the way she was characterized. I didn't like anything around her, but that's not really relevant. My favorite Doctor of the new series is probably Peter Capaldi, and Peter Capaldi, if you're a fan of this, if you haven't seen Doctor Who, he's the guy from who does he play in Suicide Squad? Is he like the Thinker or something? I think he's the Thinker. He's the guy with all the little knobs in his head. I'm embarrassed that I don't know that character's name. He's not Brainwave. I always get that guy Brainwave confused, but I think he's just the Thinker. Regardless, Peter Capaldi is a good actor who's been in a lot of things. I think he has an Academy Award for like a short film he directed too, which is kind of fun. But he was well known before Doctor Who as well. Regardless, this is not one with him. This is a Tom Baker one. I'm sorry I got off track. I do have an outline for this episode. I wanted to talk about Peter Capaldi for a second. I will admit that of the classic series, I don't really have a favorite Doctor because I don't feel like I've seen enough of the show to say who my favorite is. I definitely like Tom Baker. I've watched some of the third Doctor as well, John Pertwee. And I think he's good too. I like that. I like that incarnation, and I like a lot of things about that era of the show. But I should note that I'm far less familiar with the classic show than the modern show. Classic Doctor Who is an acquired taste. You basically, I think, to enjoy classic Who, there are three ways to enjoy it. You have to have been alive when it was coming out, so in the 60s, 70s, 80s. You have to be a child who's watching it now for the first time, probably with a lot of like hyping it up by an older person. Or you have to be like me and have been bonked on the head like 10 or 1500 times in your life in order to watch it. Because this show, I mean, in a lot of ways, like I love Star Trek, the original series. This show is significantly, in terms of like production and how good it looks, it's pretty embarrassing compared to even that. I think that Doctor Who, at least classic Doctor Who, what I would generally say is that it is a show that you watch for the ideas and you watch for some of the charming elements of it, but it's not like, by today's standards, it's objectively very flawed, I think. But that doesn't mean it's like bad or even terrible. I think it's quite worthwhile. I think there's a lot of really good stuff in Doctor Who, and I know for a fact that if you're a fan of a lot of comic book stuff, you would probably like Doctor Who, but also a lot of influential comic book writers have been inspired by Doctor Who. I know that Alan Moore, both actually, well, I'll talk about that in a second. Alan Moore wrote for the Doctor Who comics. Morrison has talked at length about being a fan of Doctor Who and has also written for the Doctor Who comics. And I know that the writers on like the classic X-Men, John Byrne, Chris Claremont, were big fans and worked a lot of ideas from this show into classic storylines. I know Days of Futures Past is heavily inspired by one of the Dalek stories. I forget which one, and it makes sense. They're both about guys who go around and exterminate people. So that makes sense. This is a show that you would probably enjoy if you're a fan of like that kind of stuff, and you can stomach older television. Anyway, I haven't talked much about this episode, and we're over 10 minutes in. I think that's okay. This needed a lot of introduction before we could actually talk about the show, unlike a lot of the other things, because Wizards of Waverly Place was easy to explain, and the other ones have been movies, and movies they don't have a lot of backstory to them usually. This has a lot of backstory, and by the way, I have to explain more. So this episode starts, it's 4 episodes, by the way. The classic Doctor Who is generally divided into serials, and they'd be like a couple of parts long. And so this is a 4-part episode. The episodes aren't very long; they're like a half hour or so. And this starts, and the Doctor is in the Tardis with 3 companions at this time. He is in the Tardis with Romana. Romana is a Time Lord herself. One of his few companions who was of his same sort of race. And then he's also there with Adric, who is a little boy, and K9, who is a funny robot dog, who they didn't keep around in the show, despite being pretty iconic. Because from what I understand, K9 was the K9 puppet was incredibly difficult to work with. Because it was, from what I understand, actually kind of automated, and it tended to malfunction. K9 is a pretty dumb part of this show, but he is iconic for a reason. They are in the TARDIS, they are traveling. At first I thought that, I was like, oh boy, they made space look really bad. It's green. Why is outer space look green? They're actually in E-space, which is another dimension. And Adric's actually from E-space, and they've been sucked there by accident, and they're trapped there. And they have been, I think, since the episode prior, or possibly even earlier than that. I haven't watched the episodes around, so I might now because I enjoyed this well enough. And it did make me want to watch more of this show, I will admit. So anyway, they're traveling through E-space. They're trying to get home, and they end up on a planet. And the planet is this kind of desolate, forested planet. There's not a lot on it, and the people on it are all like medieval peasants, straight out of like a Shakespeare production that would also be on the BBC, or like maybe a little more Robin Hood than Shakespeare, and which is strange because the Doctor is getting all these readings and stuff from K9 and from the Turdis that are saying that the planet has high levels of technology, and we very quickly meet the leaders of this society, the three who rule, and the three who rule are vampires. I'm just spoiling that. The show doesn't tell you right away. I knew before watching this that they were vampires, which is why I watched it. And they're pretty obviously vampires, but I will admit that they are cool kind of vampires in a lot of ways. Just, they're all dark-haired, sort of pale people wearing black clothes, which sounds really generic, but I think that they're a little bit more interesting than that, just because they're not really dressed like we think of like Dracula or like a character like that drinking. They drink the same way those guys do. They just drink what? But I dress the same way as characters like that. They look like medieval kings. They look like characters the AI would generate in like Crusader Kings. And they have like heavy eye makeup, but it's like very stylized eye makeup. It's not like, it's clearly not that they were supposed to have like sunken dark eyes and then, like the special effects didn't work. It's clearly stylized to an extent where they're either supposed to just have like that on their face or they're supposed to be wearing heavy eye makeup. And I think it's an interesting choice. Honestly, I don't think it looks great. I think that if this was made today, you could make them look cooler, obviously. But I think the eye makeup looks cool, especially on the one vampire. I don't remember their individual names. There's the one vampire he's like a guy, he's got a goatee, and he wears a gold crown. I think it looks really cool on him. There's also a girl one whose name is Camilla, who's just, she looks like a female vampire. It's pretty standard. And then the other one looks a little bit like Fred Armisen. And they're the three who rule. And they're clearly like these tyrannical rulers. They have all of these devoted servants who have like a slavish devotion to them. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I suspect that one of the reasons they made this episode was because they just already had all the costumes for it because it's the BBC. And Doctor Who was famously plagued with a whole lot of budgetary issues, which is why a lot of it has aged pretty poorly in terms of like the way it looks. So it would make sense that they would want to do an episode where they just recycle props they already have. We know they did that a bit, at least, for Star Trek: The Original Series, which is why there's so many episodes where they're like time traveling, or they're going to an episode, or they're going to a planet where like everyone's a mobster or something like that. Ironically, those are all good episodes of the original series, in my opinion, but that's not important. This isn't about Star Trek. Although, there is a Star Trek Doctor Who crossover called Assimilation Squared. I've never read it. I don't know if it's good or not, but it exists. One thing about this is also that just the atmosphere of it is very Hammer horror. That was intentional, I was reading. So keep that in mind as you're sort of imagining what I'm describing. It looks a little bit like a lower budget Hammer horror film. Anyway, they're most classic Doctor Who serials I've seen. It's a lot of like, they wander around for a while, or one of them gets captured and then escapes and then gets captured again. It's a lot of that. What's basically important, though, is that the Doctor and his companions learn essentially that everyone on this planet kind of doesn't know about anything else. Not just they don't know about aliens. They seem vaguely aware that aliens exist. It's more that there's no one else on the planet. It's just this one kind of village or nation that exists, ruled by the three who rule. And the Doctor and Romana and K9 very quickly realized. Actually, I don't think K9's there at the time. I don't remember. They realized. I watched this part 2 days ago, the first part. They realized very quickly that the three who rule are actually humans who had worked on a spaceship that had landed on this planet at some point. Like they're scientists, I think. One of them is the captain, I think. One of them is a scientist. It's like they're the central crew of this ship. And I may have gotten. By the way, I did just watch this. If I get a very minor detail or something wrong, you can feel free to let me know. But I'm not getting into broad, like, big picture stuff. I might forget like a character's name or something. But there's a lot of characters in this too, and most of them are just villager, stinky, smelly peasant number one, stinky, smelly peasant number two. The point that we eventually sort of get to is that the castle or fortress that the three rule in is the remnants of their spaceship, because they are this crew. And we get this really great bit in part 2, I believe. Yeah, part 2, where the Doctor and Romana slowly come to the realization that they're facing vampires, which wasn't a thing that the Doctor had ever dealt with before. And so I imagine to an audience member it would have been a big deal at the time for the Doctor to get scared. Not just know about vampires and say they're real, but to get scared that they're there. At one point, he says to Romana, "I think I know who our enemy is, but I don't want to say because it's so awful." I'm paraphrasing, but it's something along those lines. He's so worried it's vampires. And what we learn in this is that the Doctor basically does a monologue where he explains to Romana at some point, like eons ago in our planet's history, Gallifrey's history, we fought a war against vampires. The great vampires who came into our world and started infecting people. They would reproduce by turning people into the vampires we see in this episode. And it took, everything we had to beat them. They were truly powerful, very, very powerful. And we beat them back, and as far as I knew, we killed all of them. But there's some on this planet. And what we learn, essentially, is that there was one vampire who survived. He's called the King Vampire. And he escaped into E-space and has settled on this planet and has turned these human colonists into his thralls. And by extension, they've turned everyone else, all the other colonists and stuff, into their thralls. And I think that already, that's just a killer premise. It's just the idea that vampires are aliens from the beginning of time that invaded our universe from another one, and that the Time Lords had to fight like a crazy, insane war against them. And even then, they barely won. There's a bit in this where the Doctor, because I think about the Time Lords and Gallifrey is on a whole in this series and this franchise, is that they don't like to interfere with outside politics. They're xenophobic in a lot of ways, and they're sort of this aging decadent planet that's been around for since basically forever, and they're mostly all thousands of years old. They're a little bit decrepit and decadent and debauched a little bit, but in a very sexless way. It's interesting. But the Doctor gets he pulls up a proclamation from Rassilon, who's one of the sort of great figures in Gallifrey's history and in Gallifrey's politics. And it basically says, if anyone sees a vampire anywhere in reality, kill it. This is my order. I am the leader of Gallifrey. You have to kill all the vampires. And the implication that seems to be that the Doctor has never really met vampires before, at least not this close to the source of vampiric abilities, because the Doctor states essentially that he wasn't alive when this war was fought. And I mean, just that alone, that premise of just these ancient vampires from the beginning of time, and that the Time Lords had to fight them. I mean, that is just such a good premise, and it is basically never talked about again in the show ever, which is a shame. But regardless, as this episode goes on, the Doctor realizes that the way that the people of Gallifrey, the Time Lords, fought the vampires was that they had bolt ships, and they had these giant steel bolts, and they would shoot them through the hearts of the great vampires. Because the great vampire, as depicted in this, just jumping ahead a bit, is basically a kaiju. It's this giant being, because it's like a true vampire. It's basically like a demon or like a demigod, and they would impale them with these metal spikes, these steel bolts, and that was how they killed them. They had to shoot them through their heart. And the Doctor doesn't have one, because he's like, I don't have a bolt ship. Are you kidding me? I'm stuck in another dimension, and also the vampires have caught me. And Adric, who isn't super important in this episode, he's just a little boy, and he gets caught by the vampires, and that's basically most of what he does in this episode. He does a little bit, but it's not he's not as integral to the plot as the other characters are. And eventually, the Doctor realizes that the vampires have realized who he is, and so they end up, in very Hammer horror fashion, kidnapping Romana, putting her in a weird gown, and they're going to sacrifice her to the great vampire. And they're talking oh Lord, oh great one, when you rise again, you will feast on the blood of our ancient enemies. It will be the blood of a Time Lord that revives you. It's classic melodrama, schlock. Oh, it's beautiful. I love it. And anyway, the Doctor stops them. That's basically all that needs to be explained about that. He stops them. There's a giant. He basically, they launch their spaceship up in the air, and he goes, "What comes up must come down." And it comes down, it impales the great vampire as it's rising from the bowels of the planet, and with its death, the three who rule age and waste away. This is solid, cheesy B horror vampire shit, and it is just even if you don't like Doctor Who, I was gonna say even if you don't like Doctor Who, you should watch this. If you like Hammer horror and stuff, watch this. But if you can't do cheese of this kind, you probably won't enjoy this. But if you're a person who likes the Christopher Lee Draculas, or the Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter or something like that, you'd probably like this. It's very in that tradition. And that's basically it about State of Decay. They beat the vampires, and the Doctor's like, well, time to leave. We have to try to get back to our own dimension. Bye. So, what do we take away from this episode? What we take away from this episode is that vampires are really cool. And I like that they are in Doctor Who, because you wouldn't think even of that. Oh, yeah, they're definitely, there's vampires in Doctor Who. It's great how weird that is as a premise, and how I think it really works. The idea that vampires are not just real in this universe, but they are the ancient adversary of the Time Lords. The thing that basically, the Time Lords were sort of baptized in the warfare, the bloodshed against the vampires. I mean, it's just wonderful. And again, there's very little done with it in the show. From what I understand, it is almost never referenced again. There's an episode of the Matt Smith run of Doctor Who where we meet vampires in the show, and they are completely unrelated to these vampires. They are just generic, kind of boring aliens. I don't like that episode at all. I don't like most of Matt Smith's run as the Doctor, to be honest with you. I like Matt Smith well enough. He's a good actor, but that whole era is mostly bad. Not all of it, but mostly. So one thing I wanted to mention about this is, and this is, if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, you may or may not have played, but you're probably aware of the Ravenloft setting, and more specifically of the Adventure Path campaign, what have you, called The Curse of Strahd. And the reason I bring this up is not just because I want to talk about The Curse of Strahd, it's because it's pretty similar, I think, in a lot of ways. This reminded me of Curse of Strahd, as someone who has run a game of Curse of Strahd before. Like the full campaign. Is that this is similarly about a group of adventurers, sort of, adventurers who are out of their element. They don't really belong here. They feel like they're from a different kind of story, which is generally how Curse of Strahd stuff feels. Your characters have traveled from a generic D&D setting into, or a non-generic D&D setting into like a Hammer horror movie. In this other dimension, in the multiverse, where an ancient, primordial, evil vampire, dwells in his castle, and everyone around him are these like intentionally powerless peasants who he's like reduced to these low levels of technology and standard of living just so that they can't defeat him. It's similar, and I think that if I ran Curse of Strahd again, I might lean into that. Just because I think that this is... it's fun how similar they are. This really feels like, what if the party that who were in Curse of Strahd were just the Fourth Doctor, Romana, Adric, and I guess K9. This isn't a D&D podcast, by the way. There are 6 gajillion of those, and most of them are awful. And also, I should note, I think Curse of Strahd is just fine. I think it's incredibly overhyped. As someone who's run it, it is one of those campaigns that, like a lot of D&D campaigns, you really have to, like, if you run it, if you're game mastering it, or dungeon mastering it, I suppose, in Dungeons and Dragons specific terms, you really need to, like, essentially dramaturge it. You need to zhuzh it up. You need to make it a little bit better, because as written, it needs work. With all of them. And Curse of Strahd is, I think, quite guilty of that as well. And I don't think the character of Strahd, as written, is very interesting. This is not a review of that, but I would just mention that as an aside if anyone wanted to know my thoughts on Curse of Strahd. It's fun, but you need to do a lot with it. So I guess I should also note, like, I was, prior to recording this, I read quite a bit about the making of this episode. I should note, this is the 4th serial of season 18 of the classic Doctor Who. And one thing I should note about Doctor Who is that it's difficult to talk about seasons or series of Doctor Who a lot of the time. Because a lot of the time, they have 2 of, like, Series 1 and Series 5 and Series 11, because when the show started over in 2005, they didn't reboot the internal continuity at all. They just, they moved the story forward, but all of this is still canon, as much as canon can be a thing in Doctor Who, which we'll get to in a second. But, not a second, in a minute. But so you have to go, it's classic Doctor Who versus, it's season 2 of classic Who, or it's season 2 of New Who, or modern Who, or whatever you want to call it. Doesn't really matter. This is from 1980, by the way. I didn't mention that, I don't think. I didn't know what year this came out myself, I have to admit. But yeah, this is from 1980. And this was written by the director Peter Moffat. Sorry. Hold on. It was written by a guy named, I guess, Nathan Turner? John Nathan Turner, specifically. Oh boy. So, this is written by Terrence Dicks, who's one of the classic Doctor Who writers, I know. It was produced by a guy named John Nathan Turner, and I guess they had shown this to the director, but it had been rewritten at one point after to remove a lot of like the gothic atmosphere to try to make it be more of a science fiction story. And the director, Peter Moffat, was like, I'm not directing this version. You have to use the original version with all like the Hammer stuff in it. I'm not doing it if it doesn't have any of that. That's what's cool about this story, and he's right. And so this became that. You know what I mean? It stayed the way it was meant to be, and I think that is important to it being good. I think that if this had changed too much, this is an example of like sometimes a studio does need to step in and be like, don't do it that way. But other times, you have something good, you don't need to fix it. And this had a kind of muddy production from what I can tell. Tom Baker was really sick when they filmed this. Tom Baker is still alive, I should note. He wasn't like that kind of sick. He was just like not doing well. And Tom Baker has like an iconic like big curly head of hair. And they actually had to permit for this, which was the only time he ever had to do that for the show, because he was so sick. And this was the first serial that the actor who played Adric was in. First episode the actor who played Adric was in. That actor's name is Matthew Waterhouse. And his stories about this are not pleasant, to say the least. Apparently Tom Baker was a real prick on set. Not only, probably because he was sick, but as I also found out while reading about this, Tom Baker had been in a relationship with the actress who played Romana prior to this, and he had tried to, I guess they'd been sleeping with each other, and he was trying to get them to keep doing that, and she didn't want that. And because of that, they both kind of ganged up on this kid, and because they were in a bad mood, they weren't talking to each other, or all kind of shit like that. Just like, prima donna, but also like understandable human relationship shit at the same time. And but I guess good news, they ended up getting married after this, so clearly they worked it out. And yeah, and also I guess at points, Matthew Waterhouse was pretty young, so it's a little bit unreasonable as well for them to get as mad as they did. I don't think he's as young as Adric is, but regardless, it sounds like it's kind of a shit show. But it made for a pretty good episode. And I suppose I was reading recently that this has been like re-released because they did this multimedia event called Time Lord Victorious in 2020. I will admit I don't know much about that whole thing. It was like a multimedia story. They had a bunch of stories. that tied into it, like in comics and in audio dramas. I think even like a live show. And it was just like a story that they could do in 2020 that, wasn't on the show, but was just a big multimedia thing they could do, that they got a bunch of the actors back for, like David Tennant and stuff. So that's pretty cool. Because I should note, I mentioned earlier that Doctor Who is a multimedia franchise. Besides having comics for years, Doctor Who also is one of the only franchises that still really heavily does audio dramas. And they've been doing it even prior to like it becoming more mainstream. They were doing it before like DC and Marvel and stuff were doing it. They've been doing it since, I believe, before the show was even back on the air. And those Doctor Who audio dramas, from the little bit I've listened to of them, they're kind of pricey because they're very well made. But the ones I've listened to, because there are some you can listen to for free legally, they're very well done, I think. So that's actually a cool way kind of to experience the franchise, because you don't have to see the goofy special effects. You can just hear the characters describing what's happening, and they generally get the actors from the show to be on it. Even some of the bigger names, like Eric Roberts did a bunch of them, because Eric Roberts was in Doctor Who at one point, Emma Roberts' dad, and stuff like that. So that's pretty neat. Eric Roberts, of course, also the movie The Dark Knight, and also A Talking Cat, both of which are classic films directed by Christopher Nolan. So one thing I wanted to mention, speaking of it being a multimedia franchise, is that Doctor Who, like I said, I've not watched much of classic Who. I've watched a little bit, but I've seen quite a bit of the new stuff. Doctor Who's wiki, which is called Turdis Datacore, which is an extremely expansive wiki, is one of the Doctor Who, one of the wikis that is the most fun to just rabbit hole down, because you just read a page and you have no fucking idea what any of this means. And it is an easy way to kind of understand elements of the expanded universe that are hard to parse, because a lot of them are in like books or comics and stuff that there isn't really any easy way to find, either like even sometimes by paying for them or finding like a legal way to do it. I don't even think, and I mean I didn't look into this too much, to be clear. I don't even think it's easy to like find a lot of them kind of on the down low, because a lot of the multimedia stuff is like, a lot of the comics aren't published in like a comic book that you can buy. They do have those from Titan, and earlier from IDW, and before that from Marvel. They definitely were at Marvel at one point, but I don't know if there was an intermediary period. I have no idea. But one thing about the Doctor Who comics, a lot of them are in the magazine, and I don't have any way of getting that. So for a lot of it, I will just read what's on the wiki if I'm like curious what happens in a story. Anyway, so I wanted to just very briefly look at some of the expanded universe stuff concerning the vampires and the stuff surrounding it. A lot of this is sort of just me in real time looking at it, but I've read a lot of this already, and I promise you this will be at least a little bit interesting if you find the rest of this show interesting. So the vampires, the great vampires, I guess, are also sometimes referred to in universe as the Yizgoroth, which is a pretty cool name, I think. And the war between them and the Time Lords, which was supposed to, I guess, have taken place in a period called the Dark Times, is known as the Eternal War. And the Eternal War, which is also called the Great War, the First War in Heaven, the War against the Yizgoroth, or the Yizgoroth campaigns, was this, a war between the Time Lords and the vampires, and there's some. If you go on the wiki, they have some of the classic. I think a lot of this is probably Marvel era, or maybe. No, you know what? A lot of this looks like it was from like the RPGs and stuff, because Doctor Who had RPGs as well. They've got some pretty sick art of the Eternal War, and like they've made, there are depictions of the vampire spaceships, which is itself a fucking badass thing to say. Like there's a panel here of what I think is supposed to be a TARDIS approaching. Because TARDISes can shapeshift, but I think it's supposed to be a TARDIS approaching a vampire coffin ship, and it looks like, if you can imagine what a vampire spaceship / time ship would look like. It's insane. This thing is so fucking cool. And like with most of the wars in Doctor Who, it seems that it was sort of fought between, in different realities throughout time and space. Like I said, the vampires are from another universe, which, according to the Book of War, which I know for a fact, just from reading a lot of this, the Book of War is only semi-canonical, that they are from a reality known as Spiral Yizgarath, which is pretty sick as well. And so yeah, there's this giant war between them, and they fought. And I don't think any of this has really ever been depicted specifically in fiction. Like, I don't think we've had any Doctor Who stories that were like entirely set in this period. I could be wrong. If anyone knows of any, let me know. I'd like to check that out. But there are like flashbacks to it, it seems. So it says here that there was they were accidentally unleashed into the universe by a Time Lord experiment, and the Time Lords used bow ships, which fired huge bolts of steel into the vampire's heart. And the great vampires led what was called the Vampire Alliance, which was presumably, from what I can tell, an alliance of different sort of breeds and subtypes of vampires. And the Space Lords. Okay, I am wrong here. Apparently, according to this one wiki article, paragraph, at this point, the Time Lords didn't know how to time travel, so they're called the Space Lords, which is really funny. I like that as a concept. They have these coffin ships. They had like giant blood drinking machines called Kurbites, and like, I gotta be real with you. I wish this was just what Doctor Who was. Like, if you read about the Doctor Who, a lot of the Doctor Who EU stuff, it is so much weirder than anything in the show. It's insane. There are legitimately people whose favorite era of Doctor Who was when this was all we had, because between, I think it was the late 80s and I think it was the late 80s. I could be wrong about that. I think it was the late 80s and 2005. The only on-screen Doctor Who we'd had was the made-for-TV film and a sketch comedy bit called Curse the Fatal Death, which is worth checking out if you like Doctor Who at all, because it's quite funny. But part of the joke with the Curse the Fatal Death was that it was this is a side note, a bunch of actors who like couldn't do the show normally, doing Doctor Who. So it's I think like it's Rowan Atkinson is one of the doctors in that. I think Emma Thompson. I think definitely Richard E. Grant. Or maybe. And then I know for a fact, what's his name? Hugh Grant, I think, is there. I could be wrong. I'm going to double check that in a minute, but I'm pretty sure that's who's there. So for a while, all we had of Doctor Who was books and the magazine and stuff, and a lot of that stuff is really weird. I have some of those books because as a teenager, my mom found them at a thrift store and went, my son likes Doctor Who, and bought them for me. And they are all about the Eighth Doctor, who's only in that TV movie, really, in any significant sense, on live action and stuff. But he's a good character. That's a good depiction of that character, I should note. And anyway, the only vampire who survived was the king vampire. But there are a number of, I guess, legacies of it. Like I mentioned, the Time Lords are still afraid of vampires, as depicted in this episode. There are just implications throughout time, and it seems the greater sort of Doctor Who EU is that the vampires sort of persisted on Gallifrey as almost like a cult or a heretic movement, which is interesting. There's an image here of a Time Lord named Cardinal Hemal, who stole an ancient strand of vampire DNA, which is from a comic, and that's pretty cool. I like this idea of the vampires being a lingering effect. They still have implications and repercussions on the universe, even years and years and years later. I think is a very cool idea, very neat idea. And I know that there are some expanded universe stuff where the Doctor returns to this planet, or the further implications of this episode are told. So that's kind of cool. And then one thing that I do know as well is that in one of the Doctor Who audio dramas, I want to pull up the name of it here. I think it's called Annihilation. Yeah, it is Annihilation. This is a story in which the vampire war didn't end. And so it's set on an alternative Gallifrey where this war is still going on. And even, millions or however long later, and the vampires are in... they seem, from what I can tell you, I haven't listened to this, but it seems like they're still doing well. And one thing worth noting, and I'm reading this now, and this is really funny to me, is that there's a classic Doctor Who character named Morbius. And I guess in that alternate universe story, the Annihilation, Morbius is one of the ones who got turned into a vampire, and that has to be intentional. And that's really funny. I like that. Anyway, I don't have a whole lot else to say other than, if you ever want to just kill some time, look at the Doctor Who wiki. There's some crazy shit on here. Like I mentioned, there's a thing called the Book of War, which is an unlicensed, and I don't think you can get a physical copy of it anymore. It was an encyclopedia or dictionary almost of a war that was introduced in Doctor Who novels, and it's not canon, but it gets referenced by the canon writers. And I guess there's a spin-off series of books featuring characters from the Doctor Who novels that aren't published by the BBC, but the BBC's cool with them. It's called Faction Paradox. I've looked a little bit into that stuff. It seems kind of neat. Most of it is fairly removed from Doctor Who, from what I can tell. And that's pretty awesome. I like that idea of a thing that's a spin-off of a thing. That's a spin-off of a thing, and by the end of it, it's a different thing. I think that's neat. One more thing I wanted to note before, because I mentioned before that Doctor Who was at one point published by Marvel, and like I mentioned, it was at one point written by Alan Moore. And Leah Moore, his daughter, also worked on later on IDW Doctor Who. And one thing about that is that he, from what I understand, introduced a lot of like concepts that are still sort of relevant in Doctor Who now. I believe, let's see here. Yeah, it says he wrote a story called Star Death, which is an origin story of the Time Lords, presumably not canon, but it's pretty cool that he did that. And this was republished in later like Marvel stuff, and it also says was an influence on a lot of the writers for the later Doctor Who stuff. And but he also introduces a group of characters in that. I remember reading about this a while ago, so I'm just pulling it back up. Called the Order of the Black Sun, who are apparently the first people who who are like in a temporal war with the Doctor, and they appear, from what I can tell, again I haven't read this, although I would like to. They seem to in some way be like an evil Green Lantern Corps. Oh no, sorry, I legitimately here it says Alan Moore mentioned that they were a reference to the Green Lantern Corps. But part of what's cool is that it mentions that they are from Earth 5. And if you go to the Marvel Wiki, Marvel database, what do you know? Canonically, apparently, Earth 5 is still considered, this is the canonical Earth 5 of the Marvel multiverse, is the one from this Doctor Who comic. And the Doctor isn't canon to Marvel, but I believe there's a number of references to the Doctor throughout Marvel, obviously. I'm pretty sure he interacted at least with a number of the the Marvel UK characters. I'm gonna double check here, but I'm fairly certain that the Marvel Doctor did in fact interact with Death's Head, if I'm not mistaken, who is still a canon character. And I know also that a lot of what was introduced in the Marvel stuff is now considered, like, it is property of the BBC to some degree at least. But other elements of it are still under the control of Marvel. I think because of how things were introduced, I believe there are characters who would appear later. I think a lot of them were created by Alan Moore, who are still owned in theory by Marvel Comics. I could be wrong about that, but I'm fairly certain. And obviously there have been references and homages to Doctor Who throughout Marvel, even like quite recently. Like it is clearly an influence. If you read like Exiles and stuff, there's like some explicit references to Doctor Who, but there's also just like homages to it, and clearly like the people who were writing that were inspired by this. And like I mentioned, the Claremont, I think, was to a degree. And even if you look at like Alan Moore's Miracle Man, there's some Doctor Who influence in there. His Captain Britain. I mean, I know I got a little bit off topic here. This is borderline just a comics episode, but I wanted to note that, like, even if you're not a fan of Doctor Who, which I don't blame you for, I always joke that whenever people tell me, "Oh, I don't like Doctor Who," I'm like, "Good, you're a normal person. You aren't broken like me." it's influential, and I think you kind of have to respect it. The fact that it had such an influence on a lot of things we like. I think I mentioned on the podcast. There's an episode of Yeah, I mentioned on the page. I haven't mentioned on the podcast. There's a Star Trek, the original series episode, that is very similar to Doctor Who. But if you want to imagine what an American Doctor Who would have looked like, the episode of Star Trek, the original series, Annihilation Earth. What am I talking about? Assignment Earth, with Gary Seven and Isis the cat, is kind of what I'd imagine an American Doctor Who would look like, and I might review that for an episode at some point, because that's a great episode of the original series. I want to do some stuff about Star Trek. If anyone has like recommendations for if that should be on this show or a different show or something, let me know. But yeah, this overall, this is a really fun story. I mostly just wanted to talk about it because of just how cool the concept of the great intergalactic, interdimensional vampire war is. I love the idea of vampires as something eldritch, almost Lovecraftian, but also something to be warred against, something that was on this great cosmic level. And just the concept of the vampire wars is very cool. Just as like a throwaway line, the way that the Doctor treats it almost like a half-remembered fairy tale. It's just, there's so much great stuff in this episode. So I'm going to leave it there. I don't have a whole lot else to say. And my throat is starting to hurt. I was at work today, so I'm a bit tired. But without further ado, I want to just mention this show hasn't gotten a lot of views or feedback or anything like that. I have a number of people who have reached out to me and told me that they're enjoying it and that they're happy that I'm doing it. If you know people who would enjoy this show, I encourage you to let them know about it. But ultimately, I mean, DracCast is a thing I'm partially just doing for myself. I don't expect to be making money off of this. But yeah, I mean, I want people to interact with me more so that I can get ideas for stuff to do and hear what people like about the show and what they don't. So yeah, just let any of your friends who might enjoy this kind of thing know about the show if you want. I mean, I'm not gonna make you, but yeah, I just encourage it because especially that last episode, I did not get a lot of I don't think a lot of people watched it, and that's a little, it sucks. It doesn't matter that much, of course. It's fucking DracCast. It doesn't really matter. There are other podcasts you could be listening to. But my point is just that I have fun doing it, and I'm going to keep doing it no matter how many people are watching, at least for a while. But, it's more fun if there's people listening, is all I'm saying. But I appreciate everyone who does listen immensely, and anyone who even, doesn't consistently listen, but has just, told me that they, who've listened to some of it or whatever. I love everyone. I love y'all. And I thank you for all of the support I've gotten on this. And I always have to say something funny at the end of the episode. So I'm going to say, big chungus heckin' epic popper. And this can go on the front page or